I'm Phil Gale. Welcome to The Day. We begin with one of the largest attacks on Russia since the start of the Ukraine war. More than 600 drones reportedly targeted the Moscow area overnight in a sustained aerial assault. Now, it comes just days after another blitz on the Russian capital and the surrounding region. Moscow officials say most drones were intercepted on approach. Ukraine's increasingly launched swarms of drones at warehouses belonging to the online retailer Wildberries in an attempt to damage Russia's war economy. Meanwhile, Moscow is threatening consequences for the United Kingdom after the reported use of British drones for long-range strikes against Russia. Moscow has repeatedly warned Ukraine's Western allies that supplying Kyiv with weapons could provoke retaliatory measures. Britain's Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, shrugged off the Kremlin's threats and promised his continuing support.
This is the UK doing what it has long said it would do, which is to support Ukraine 100% against this illegal war led by Vladimir Putin.
Let's bring in DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv. He's been covering the Ukraine war since it began. Welcome, Nick. Not long ago, it seemed that like big news whenever Ukraine targeted Moscow. Now we're seeing hundreds of drones raining down on the Russian capital. What sort of impact are these attacks having?
I think, Phil, when you look at Moscow, obviously this is still the best defended part of Russia and lots of those drones will be intercepted. If you speak to people here off camera, they'll say that even getting 10% of their drones past Russia's defences is an achievement, even less potentially in Moscow with so much in the way of air defences. But I think that isn't necessarily a problem. It is forcing Russia to concentrate a lot of its air defences in and around the capital, given the kind of political damage of the images we saw earlier in the summer of burning oil refineries on the edge of Moscow, given the kind of role that Moscow plays in that very centralised Russian system. And that's taking away resources from the front lines here in Ukraine, where Russia's troops are now less well defended than they used to be from Ukrainian attack, and also from the rest of Russia, where we're seeing pretty important industrial centres, weapons factories that previously were protected largely by their distance from Ukraine's borders, right? We've had an attack on a factory that produces the rockets that Russia needs to get its satellites into orbit. That's 900,000 kilometres away from Ukraine's borders. Previously, those didn't need to be particularly well defended because it was just deemed to be too far away. And now Ukraine is able to kind of have success because Moscow is basically just monopolising so much of the defences.
OK, so this is not just a hot war, but a war against Russia's economy. What's the situation in Ukraine?
Well, certainly we've seen Ukraine attacking particularly Wildberries. People will have heard of the Russian equivalent to Amazon, and we've had Russia replying in kind, going after logistics centres, warehouses, and we have now for the first time, this is pretty new in Kyiv, seen empty supermarket shelves. There isn't a food shortage as such, but there is definitely a logistics problem. Usually it's resolved pretty quickly, and things like eggs that'll be away from the supermarket shelves for a couple of days will then be back, or they'll be available in another shop. But that's certainly a new quality to this war. That's something people here were confronted with for all the kind of power outages and issues with water and everything that depends on electricity. So we're seeing that kind of tit for tat. I guess the issue here is that previously it was all one way. It was all coming towards Ukraine. When you think about things like the ports, which was all about Odessa getting hit in previous years, now Ukraine is doing the same to Russia's grain exports. But it is becoming increasingly difficult here in Kyiv, and obviously everyone will have heard of the lack of Patriot interceptor missiles, so people here having many more sleepless nights and also not hearing outgoing fire when those missiles come in. I think that's quite important psychologically. It is a lot more kind of scary for people here to just hear those missiles coming in one after another without anything trying to stop them.
And President Zelensky, of course, desperate for those interceptor missiles. Is there any hope that that will change?
I think people are very sceptical about any kind of promises coming out of the US right now. We had that grand promise from President Trump on the stage with Zelensky back then, which, as we now know, hadn't been discussed with the manufacturers. Now, lots of technicalities, a sense that maybe those American companies don't want to contradict Donald Trump in public, but are basically dragging their feet on the technicalities. And even if it were to happen in terms of, Ukraine being able to produce stuff under license, that's years away. In terms of getting US stocks, that's not something that anyone sees happening anytime soon. Obviously, European countries countries still have stocks that they could share with Ukraine, even though they've given a lot already. I think the big hope right now is attacking the missiles where they are, at the launch sites, preventing Russia sending in those missiles. Russia's using repurposed air defense missiles, S-400 missiles, that are launched basically just 250 kilometers away from Kyiv, just beyond the Russian border. So Ukraine now desperate to hunt those launchers and just to prevent them being launched, making it their way in the air. But basically, once they are on their trajectory above Kyiv, there is nothing to stop them for now. And there is just a sense that that is the only game in town, attacking Russia's ability to produce these weapons and trying to attack them and destroy them on the ground.
Meanwhile, Russia's threatened the UK over Ukraine's reported use of British drones in long-range strikes against Russia. Should the UK and Ukraine's other NATO backers be concerned about Russian reprisals?
I'm not sure there's much to this story. I mean, obviously they had to respond to this news about British-built drones being used against Russia, but it is a whole lot less of a big deal than the cruise missiles from the UK and France, the Storm Shadow or Scalp, in their various modifications that have been used now for over a year and that have much more in the way of destructive force than any of these drones. So we've been there and passed there, and Russia has got used to it. I think this is just another demonstration of those red lines that Vladimir Putin likes talking about, that have been proven time and time again by Ukraine to basically not count for a lot as long as he's not using nuclear weapons. And we believe from Ukrainian sources and other sources that the Chinese have told him that that is not on an option that they are willing to let him play with. So basically, he has escalated as far as he can. There are constantly, kind of sabotage acts being carried out across Western Europe, but much beyond there, there's not a lot further that he can go for now to try and, offer reprisals for, further equipment provided.
OK, Nick, thanks for that. Nick Connolly in Kyiv.